Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Growth Support. My name is Neil, and today I'm joined by Paul Tucker to talk about defining and creating values for your teams or organizations. And I think it was a wonderful and great conversation. Paul has a lot to share and a great personal experiences as well. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. A little disclaimer. My personal audio didn't get set up right, unfortunately, so I apologize in advance for your ears. But regardless, I think it's definitely a conversation worth listening to. So again, I hope you enjoy.
We started talking, and I love what you do around, you're on LinkedIn, really actively talking about values and culture and everything there and around authenticity and everything there. So that's also one of the reasons why I prompted this conversation, because I think it's really something that is super impactful for teams and leaders and people to be thinking about, because if they're not actively thinking about it, it gets put on the back burner, and then it really, you want
Yeah.
to actively have an intention behind the things that you do. I'm curious what you would kind of think about in that direction. Or like, why is that such a passionate topic for you?
Uh, Pain is the first thing that comes to mind is that either pain I have received from others who did not put values front and center, um, and really see people as people. So I've been the recipient of some of that, and then also, uh, humbly, candidly, that I have caused pain to other people through me losing sight of how values should instruct my behavior, how it should guide who I am and what I am in the day to day. And when you see or experience that pain or see it experienced by others, if you're the one who's in fact caused it, I'd say that I've been fortunate enough, in God's kindness to start to learn from that and realize something has to change. So this isn't about my mastery of it, but rather my passion for it, and desire to see growth in myself and then to see growth in others. Like if we don't talk about it, it's not going to change. And if it doesn't change, we're going to continue to see these same cancerous environments where people keep getting hurt and they don't need to be. There's business is always hard. Teams are always hard, but it doesn't need to be the same level of pain and hardship that I think that we introduce through operating without values.
Wonderfully said, and I think that's a very, deep way of or place that you're coming from in that sense of like it really has personally affected you and others, and yeah, I feel that as well. Um, Before we jump too far into diving into the details of what that means and everything, for those who may not know you, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and where you come from?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Tucker. I born and raised in the greater Kansas City area. I spent most of my formative growing up years about 45 minutes outside of Kansas City on a small farm, with lots of pets and animals and critters and dirt and outdoors. So that was very important to me. And now I am married, coming up on 15 years to my wife, Becky, and together we have 6 kids. Our oldest is 13 and our youngest is 4. And we now live on a little bit of acreage in Independence, Missouri, kind of in a rural area outside of city limits, where we're joined by 3 cats and 6 chickens, or 3 cats and 16 chickens. And so lots of fun there. As far as my professional journey, I grew up working with my dad. He was a general contractor, and I really thought that would be my trade, and was following him in that. Had about a decade or so through, junior high into high school into college age of working construction and primarily doing cabinetry and casework and stuff like that. And the housing recession and really just the whole credit recession of kind of 2008 hit, And I was really fortunate to make the leap into an entry-level IT customer support role, working part-time. It was one of those things where it's like, this is a good opportunity. Let's try it and see if I can make the leap. And I did. And the rest is history, as they say. I realized that this wasn't just a stepping stone for me, that I actually loved it. And I had a knack for it. And I loved the people aspect, the fixing, the serving, and obviously being close to technology. And I dove in headfirst in the last almost 20, not quite 20 years has been in customer support. The last almost 10 have been in SaaS organizations, specifically in a leadership capacity. And that's how you and I met, Neil. So through various communities that we're both members of.
True, true, true. I'm really curious because like a lot of people who I talk to, and most of the people in the communities are pretty much come from a very similar background where it's, yeah, I fell into support and just kind of ended up here and then stuck with it. We found it was the way. I'm always curious to find out what shapes that experience for people as well. Like you come from also general contracting before that with your father, you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that you carried from your contracting days and experience into the way that you do or did or think about support?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, just off the top of my head, I don't know that I've really chewed on this one a lot. I would say that there's a certain practicality that my father and his trade instilled in me, which is just this idea of durability and simplicity and kind of marrying those two concepts together. And that really informs a lot of what I do in customer support, is this desire to not overcomplicate, but yet at the same time to make things that are durable and will last and are memorable, scalable. We have these buzzwords that we use, like make it scalable. But when you come at it from a building perspective or, a construction perspective, the idea of scalability, it's like, oh yeah, I can kind of see how structures and frameworks and that sort of stuff kind of fits in. So I would say that those were formative to me. Additionally, my dad and really some other folks that my dad worked alongside were instructive in seeing how they worked with people and how it didn't really matter if they just delivered the solution, if they couldn't create and maintain a meaningful relationship along the way, that really the quality of their work became secondary to the customer. And I think that mindset coming in the door with it's not just quality, it's not just customer. You have to marry these ideas again together to build something meaningful.
And really, obviously buzzwords aside, make sure it's a long lasting. And when you mentioned durable experience, it's a very interesting thing seeing how, even though some experiences and industries and things might be so different at face value, there's so much that you can carry over. And that kind of shapes the way that you look and think about it in terms of that. I really like the durable but simple concept that you mentioned, because it doesn't need to be overcomplicated. It doesn't need to be crazy. It doesn't need to be miraculous. It just needs to get the job done sometimes.
Yeah.
You mentioned like it kind of instills working with people, and you're building it out, and you talk about kind of growing that. And the whole reason we started this conversation was talking about values. And one thing that came to my mind when you said, like, yeah, keep it simple, it doesn't need to be super complicated, is that in the context of values, I think sometimes it does get overcomplicated. And it's when you overcomplicate a mission or your values or what you stand for, in a sense, people lose sense of what it actually means in practice. Is that something, how are you helping to try to instill values? It doesn't need to be just in your one experience or teams, but that they can take with them as a team or as a leader.
Yeah. One experience, and this is not unique to me, that I've encountered over the years is company values that are not memorable they might be good, but they're not memorable. They might even come from a good place of like, oh yeah, I do want to, as a person, I would like to live out those values. So I'm even raising the bar here that these are solid values. We've all encountered the values that are absolutely terrible and do nothing to inspire. So there's those, but let's just assume these are actually good values. But there's so many of them, or they're so lengthy in their description that they're not memorable. And going back to those systems and kind of rubric thinking, which is I need values are supposed to anchor you in the moment. So you need to be able to get to those, I just snapped. I don't know if the microphone caught that, but you need to get to those values immediately in the moment of tension or the moment of struggle to recognize like, this anchor, what is it anchoring me to? Where am I at here in that moment? And if you have, I'll say really ideally, whether it's a team or a company, you don't want more than 3 values. I would say if you're over 5, you're way over. Like you might be able to get away with 4, maybe 5. But ideally it's more like 2 or 3 things that are going to be instructive to you. And if you go beyond that, you're really just inflicting pain on someone's memory. And in the moment, they're trying to remember CPR. Why are there only 3 things in CPR? Well, it's to make it easy to remember. Or in the United States, 911 is the emergency number that you call. Why isn't that 10 digits? Well, because you need to be able to remember it in the heat of the moment. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of people make with their values, even good values, is that they give people too much. And through simplicity often comes clarity. And I think that that's something that myself over the years have been working on. And then two, that's something that can obviously be a target for others.
I love that within simplicity comes clarity as well. Specifically, that line is it really, really stands out. I think that's great because if you're overcomplicated, and if you have like 5, 6, 10 values, somebody is probably only going to remember 1 or 2 of them anyways. Like if you ask them about it on the moment, and if you go through things, when you're talking about values and you're talking about experiencing these things, you mentioned, let's assume we have good values, because if you value everything, your value might as well be everything, right? When you're overcomplicating them, when you're simplifying, or when you're thinking of making them, how would you say that you kind of look at it getting started? Like, say, for example, you mentioned we have good values. What if you don't have any values as a team or an organization? What did you think about, where should you get started?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite questions. And it goes back to, Neil, you may have heard or seen me talk about this before, but this whole tree metaphor, most companies, when they create their values, so picture an apple tree for our example here, that they will look at the fruit on the apple tree, which we'll say is the results, and they'll examine the results within the company, and they'll either decide we like these results and we want more of them, or on the flip side, maybe these are unhealthy results, we don't like them. So then in turn, the company will say, well, what sort of behaviors are driving these results? So now they're looking at branches, and they then make a decision based off of, okay, well, we want the apples to be like this. So then we're going to think about these behaviors that we want. Those are kind of our branches. So we want our team to do this, like stop making these, rotten apples, or make more of these healthy apples. So do this behavior. And then the follow-on thought becomes, well, that sounds kind of harsh. Maybe we could think of some values that align with these behaviors that will get us the results that we want. And so then they choose values, really looking at fruit, and then saying, these are the behaviors. And then they say, okay, well, let's make some values that reinforce that. And values end up becoming a manipulator within the company, as opposed to the actual foundational kind of roots element of a tree. That's what the values should be. They're the roots of the tree. and they create the health of the whole organization. It's where the nutrients come from. And then deeper than that is that those roots are actually sunk into soil, which I would say is your beliefs. So what do you actually believe to be true? And this is really broad. Some people, default to causes or ideals of like, I'm passionate about, this. Great. That's good. That's probably actually more motivated from your values than it is from, that's not actually a belief. So what I encourage people to do, and this is what I've done with teams over the years and have helped some companies through this as well, is like, forget about the fruit, forget about the tree branches. Like, let's just go back to an orchard real quick. If you want healthy trees, you have to start with the soil. So that way you're actually cultivating an environment where the beliefs are actually conducive to healthy trees. Then you start thinking, what sort of values really matter? And when you're picking values, I encourage people to think in kind of 3 terms. You can riff on this and kind of go different directions, but one is to think about how we think. So, and that might be a think in the sense of how we perceive the world around us, how we perceive others, how we behave or how we live or how we interact with people, and then how we do our work. So it's basically thoughts, relationships, work. And when you start thinking in those, like, what are some defining values that speak to those areas? They don't need to be unique. A lot of companies, a lot of teams get stuck on like, we need to have these values that no one's heard of before. I would actually warn someone that if no one has heard of them before, you've probably picked poorly in your selection process. Values are pretty common, and don't be alarmed that you have similar values to another team, another company, or whatever. That's fine. Like, that's not the point. If you end up being unique, cool, good for you. That's not really the point, though. It's sort of like a ship sailing across the ocean, and they're all 200 years ago, and someone's decided that they're going to use a different North Star to chart their course because everyone else is using the same North Star. It's like, don't stop.
Boring, man. Why would we do that?
Yeah. I have all these startup founder mode type things I want to interject there, but I'm going to move on past that of make the world a better place and stuff. But so yeah, that's kind of the thought, is you need to be thinking about, what do I actually believe about the world? What do I believe is important about teams, about companies? What do I want, kind of this tombstone living, where you're thinking, what do I want to be said about me, about my teams, about my company at the end of life or the end of my life? That's where kind of beliefs start to bubble up from, then narrowing it down to a few values or statements that come from that. When you have those healthy roots, you'll note that as you start to instruct your team on them, you start to recall to mind, you start to compare behaviors. Again, now we're getting to the branches, the trunk of the tree. You start comparing those behaviors to the values and saying, hey, like when you did this, it didn't align with our value of kindness. Like, can you think of how we could have handled this in a more kind way? And I'm just grabbing at straws here.
Yeah.
And then you start the pruning process. You start the nurturing process, where you see that value of, for example, kindness being demonstrated. You start raising that. You start building a little fence around it. Like, no, let that keep sprouting. Like, that is the tree. That's what we want.
Recognition. Go.
You got it. Yeah. And then eventually you do get the fruit, the results, those metrics that you're after. But like I said, too many people look at everything around them, the results, the numbers, the metrics, and then they drill back down without actually creating a healthy tree along the way. And in turn, it withers, it dies, it creates burnout in your team. I'm kind of just word vomiting here, but hopefully that's a helpful tour.
I think it's a great analogy in the sense, you really need to create a strong foundation, and it's not that those values should just be a direct correlation to the results that you want, but should be really solidifying the culture that then creates those values within themselves. And when it comes to, like, it sounds like you've heard a lot of values and gone through this process quite a bit. I'm curious, because it doesn't need to be a super serious conversation in that sense. What's the worst value that you've ever seen, and what's the best value that you've ever seen?
Um, I don't know if it's necessarily the worst. Well, yes, I can tell you what the worst is. The worst is always going to be something along the lines of stakeholder value. That is the most uninspiring, unless you own major equity in the company. That is the most uninspiring value ever. And really, it's a buzzword. And if you reduce it down to its minimum, the value, one word, is just money. So like one of our values is money. And so I always, and again, I get it. Like companies need to make money to survive. They need to make money to be able to pay their employees. They need to make money to be able to create shareholder value. It is a thing. It is a thing. I just don't think that when you get in the trenches, especially with your people, maybe even as a CEO or senior executive, you might need that to be thinking in those systems and rubrics, as we talked about earlier, of shareholder value. Because yeah, at the end of the day, you might be thinking, this company has to produce shareholder value. And if I'm not, I've got to make some decisions. I get that. But that is more of a rubric or a system of thinking than it is a value along the way. So that's one that I always pick on, and then ask people to like, so what does that mean? Keep drilling. And at the end of the day, generally it comes back to, we put this on here because our investors or board of directors wanted it and we don't even like it. Or it is, we just really love money and that's the only reason we're here, which can be, not always, but it can be an indicator that that environment is very unhealthy, and their value of people, seeing people as human capital as opposed to actual thinkers, doers, achievers that live a life away from the desk too. So that's the one that I always, that's the one I hate the most, I would say. A close follow-up, but this one actually can come from a good place, is customer-centric or customer-obsessed, which is ironic coming from a guy who's made his career in customer support and a lot of CX things and whatnot. But one thing that I try to remind teams and leaders, executive leaders as well, about with values is this question. It's from a friend of mine that he's fond of it, is what's the take-home value? And I love that question because no one goes home, and maybe forgive me if you've heard this before or heard me riff on this before. No one goes home and talks to their kids, like tucking little Timmy in bed at night, and says, Timmy, like the next time so-and-so picks on you at the playground, you just need to be customer obsessed. Like no one, there's no take home value there. No one's instructing their kids. No one's informing their behavior away from work based off of these values. And the core thing with core values, is that they do need to be shared. If they're not shared, if they're just one person's statement of belief or one person's statement of value, you will never rally a team and actually create alignment and authenticity across the team, or across the entire company. I think customer obsession oftentimes, so I can't hit as hard on this one, customer obsession as a value oftentimes is actually motivated from a really good place. And as I've drilled into that, sure, a few people will go back to some sort of, our board wanted us, or we saw this other company use it and we thought it sounded nice and we used it too. But a lot of times when I drill into it, you start getting these ideas of care, or kindness, or others before self, or kind of these sort of baseline ideas. And then at this point, I'm like, no, you're actually getting at a value now. So you've probably poorly expressed a good intention. So it boils down to this better words type thinking of like, cool, okay, you probably should have just spent some more time thinking about that further. And then your little descriptive sentence or descriptive paragraph that follows that 1 to 3 word value, should have then baked out how that looks towards customers, towards your team, towards, whatnot.
It's like what you mentioned before, right? Simplicity creates clarity in that sense. So you don't need to just
Absolutely.
use a buzzword or a placeholder word because it sounds, really nice, or there. Like if it's clear and it's at the core of what you want it to be, then that's the most important thing that people can relate to and also bring home in that sense. I love what you talked about a couple of things there, right? When you say, it's shareholder value, it's stakeholder value as a value within itself. It doesn't translate, down when you're in the trenches, that you're by yourself, at the workplace, or you're not in that higher level, in that sense. If you're on the front lines, how are you actually going to really relate to that value or look like in practice,
Absolutely.
right? And then you also said, it's for people to be able to take home that they actually, relate to and share that value within itself. So it prompts a couple of questions for me. Like, one, who does
Yeah.
values ultimately serve? Because you create values for a purpose and for a reason, for people to be able to be inspired and instill in their work and instill in the culture that you build as a team. And if we're building that culture around centered values, who is it serving would be the biggest question. Because if you say shareholder value,
Mm.
stakeholder value, it seems like it's only serving one audience. If you say you're customer obsessed, who is it serving? How do you, or what do you think, should values serve, or who should that be?
Yeah. Love, 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 love this question. We're getting down to the meat and potatoes, as it were, of who values serve. Broadly speaking, I would say it serves the humans. So, and I hate to say that that's a thing, but a lot of times people think more too noble with their values. They think too high, too lofty, to change the world, instead of thinking, how do I serve the humans? And I say that broadly, intentionally, because it might be, how do I serve my customers? How do I serve my team? How do I serve my leaders? Just all across the board, how does this interface with people? Values are for people, values are for humans, full stop. More specifically, though, values are for teams, or values are for people. And if you're creating your values for any other purpose, whether it was because it was some sort of a business plan thing that you read, we need our mission statement, we need our values, we need all these different things. I'm not hating on those things, by the way. They can be very helpful. I think that too many companies don't spend the time necessary to think in first principles, like mission statements and business plans and values. Now, they might go too far into the weeds and make it this really intense thing, but yeah, it's for people. And when you get away from that, you start crafting values that are for business objectives instead of nurturing the people who will perform or complete or pursue the business objectives. Again, it's the whole first principles thinking. It's the fruit, looking at the fruit and then trying to squeeze it to make more fruit. It doesn't work that way. You have to go back to the roots. You have to go back to the soil and then grow something meaningful. So it's for the people. They are the ones who will have the values or adopt the values. They are the ones who will align their behaviors. They're the ones that, through those behaviors, will produce results. So it's for them. That's who it's for.
But Paul, listen, I made my mission statement, my values. I really tried to focus on making sure that they serve the people. They're going to be great. They're super simple. They're awesome. I think they are. I rolled them out with my teams. I'm not saying this in like me as in actually me, role playing a little bit. I rolled them out to my teams. It's been there for a few months, but nobody seems to be really taking to it. What am I supposed to do now?
This is a fun one. So, personally, this is a part of my journey, which was, I love values. I would say I'm a values first person. I think about it when I'm at home. I think about it, not necessarily the company's values, but I think about my values and how I want to, raise my kids, and how I want to, interact with my wife, how I want to interact with the community and stuff. And then at work, it's like, woo, like it's just, free for all of like, do the thing. And yet we have these good values that I helped create. So where am I at next? Um, I, so moment of transparency, after doing a rollout, a decade ago of values, and the team was all about it. Like these were good and they still hold up. Like these are good values. Started talking with the team, like, hey, what do you think? Oh yeah, we're all about it. Like, yeah, love it, love it. This represents us. Like it's our vibe, blah, blah, blah. And then a couple months later, like nothing had really changed and I felt completely stuck. I started asking in one-on-ones, what are our values? No one could remember them. And, maybe they'd get one out of four or whatever. And what I realized is as a leader, I was not incorporating values into our day-to-day conversations. I was not actually creating a framework for the entire team to see their behaviors as values motivated to the positive or to the negative. So the first thing I started doing is when I praised behavior or when I felt the need to coach behavior, I would always pause and then ask myself, how can I connect this back to one of our values? So a real case in point was someone was regularly late to their shift. And instead of, hey, here's the expectation, here's what you're doing, look how it's impacting your team, there's a time and a place to make those statements. I don't think that they necessarily need to be removed from the conversation, but instead led with, hey, these are our 4 values. One of them is integrity. You said that was important to you. As you look at you being late, can you explain to me how does that make you feel? Do you feel like you are living out your intentions towards integrity? Do you feel like are you living it up? Like, are you actually representing that value? And to see the person go from kind of a bristled, like, here comes the tardy reprimand, to soften to being like, no, like, forget the company. Like, I'm not living out what I want to be. And then to connect with that and say like, hey, well, let's talk about your integrity for a second. Like how are other people viewing your integrity? How are you creating a lifestyle of integrity? What are some actions you can put in that, like, yeah, you relate, I know you relate, but that's a downstream, that's a fruit, that's a result. So let's talk about the health of the tree real quick. Where are you at? And then start digging in and getting into some practical steps of what behaviors, what sort of things do you need to do? What do you actually need to believe about your life that would make you wake up earlier or not do this or do that, that enables you to show up on time and be where you're supposed to be. So those sort of conversations and slowing down enough to be able to insert the values in as first, and then have those meaningful conversations rather than give me the metrics, give me the results. I want to see the fruit. You're not giving me the fruit. Now get back out there. And I'm not saying that everyone talks in those tones, but on the receiving end, it can often feel that way where you're like, they don't really care about me as a person. They don't see me. They just see the metric. They just see the result. Sadly for myself, that's often been the case. It's like, you guys are making me look bad. Go out there. Like, you got to show up and be here. And you don't have to do a little self-counseling there with me about values and how I need to think differently about those approaches. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, I think what a lot of people tend to fall back on is just, we just need to get it done. Just, it'll be quick.
Yeah.
Let's just have the conversation. Let's get it over with. But if you really do want to have a full, like, values first culture and really embed those values, it takes time and it takes an investment of your effort and intention to really make sure that you have those full conversations instead of just, yeah, you need to be doing the thing, just do the thing. And I think it just goes to show, like, as you mentioned, you just need to slow it down, really connect it back and think about that behavior that you want to either coach or promote more of, and how it connects back to those values. Because I'll say one of the things that I have, luckily enough, is we have a hybrid work environment. So for us, when we're in onboarding, we're in office the whole time, for the onboarding periods. And not say anything remote or hybrid or in office or anything like that is different. But in my experience, I have posters of our values and definitions like across the wall in my office, just like how if you're watching the video, you have, posters against your wall, right?
Mm-hmm.
And every single time in onboard, I'm like, yes, but that goes back to our value point.
Love it.
This is why, trying to embed those. Have you seen a difference of the time investment, or like really how you can start building the muscle of value early on for a difference of remotes versus hybrids or in-office experience, and what makes that so different?
Yeah. So I've been on all three of those, in office, hybrid, and remote. And I would say that remote is harder in that aspect, because you can't, to your point about plastering on the wall. And for those of you who can't see in the background of the camera, I have some cheesy inspirational sayings on my wall. I'm all about it. And then also those smaller posters are actually personal values for yours truly. So yeah, so in the remote dynamic, I've just found that you have to make it a part of the conversation so much more, and be constantly driving back to it in a different way. You have to build out some resources to be able to make those ad hoc available to anyone, and then constantly reference them, whether it's inserting it into a slide deck, whether it's making a part of your onboarding where they have to review this. One of my favorite things to do is in performance reviews, and I also coach leaders on this too. Especially if you're making company values, you're making team values, this is difficult because you might not have system-wide or company-wide support on this. But use your values as specific areas in which you provide feedback or input in their career development. So you might have this, needs, 1 to 5 type rating system, but make it for, I used integrity earlier, make it for integrity. And then give some real world explanation of their behaviors, strengths and weaknesses, areas for growth, and then areas for that might not reflect the growth, or might reflect growth, I should say. That just talk about that, frame it up for them in those sort of ways. It's just, again, another way that you can insert in those values, even in a remote environment where it's a part of your conversational cycle along the way. But yeah, it's not easy. It takes a lot of intentionality. You won't get there by accident. But I applaud any leader, any team member, any executive who's even thinking about values and how can we better align our team? How can we better anchor our team and create those roots? Good for you. It's the intention that often produces the first evidence of results and change. So keep on that path. Don't abandon it. If you're even thinking seriously about it, you're already making a step in the right direction.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect moment to kind of wrap up our conversation in that sense, because like it does take that intentionality. And if you're at least starting to really give it a serious thought, you're in the right place, as you mentioned. I actually seriously thought that, given the silliness of our interactions online, that our talk in person was going to be absolutely hysterically silly and that we were just going to go wild about it. But I absolutely love the thoughts and the experience that you shared, because I think that it really does take, coming from a very, as you mentioned, values are for people. It comes from a very human place, and values are for humans. And that's what we can aim to achieve, or can aim to do, to be able to help people grow, not only at work, but also their personal values as well.
Love it. Thanks so much for having me. And to your point, the risk is always real of when you're dealing with Paul Tucker, which self-described campfire philosopher here, that sometimes it's just laughter and jokes, and sometimes it's heavy, meaty stuff like this. But I loved the opportunity, and thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much. I have one last question.
Okay.
We already talked a little bit about your general contracting career and how it transitioned to support skills, but outside of professional life in general, but just over the course of your career, Is there one thing that you've learned that stuck with you that you still hold up today?
Would say that the one idea that continually comes back to me is that you are what you are in secret. Um, in other words, what you do in private when no one sees is the real you. And that has been instructive and very challenging to recognize what behaviors come about when I am alone, when I think no one sees, whether it's the laziness, the idleness, the selfishness, or whatever. Um, that continues to be very instructive to me. It's something that I heard when I was just a kid. Um, and I find myself often referring back to that and challenging myself with it, not from a guilt motivated perspective, but just man, like what you see of yourself in private, that's the real you, dude. So get busy. There's work to be done.
Hmm. Yeah, I hear you. That makes a lot of sense because that at the end of the day, when nobody is there, that's how you act is what you are, and what you do. We went from opening soft to a very deep and meaty conversation to some silly laughs, and then back to like the hard hitting, deep
I feel like we need to cry now
conversation
or
as well.
something.
Indeed. Well, it's been very, very wonderful conversation, and thank you again so much for your time. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Neil. Appreciate it.